Hello and welcome to my channel where we talk about reading, writing, and the general making of books. I'm Mary and today I'm going to read chapter 2 from my book, Escape from Hell. If this is the kind of content you're interested in, please like, comment, and subscribe. So I already read chapter 1. I'll link that video below, and then this is also in a playlist with all of the chapters I've read. So as I read further chapters, you'll be able to find those in the playlist, and I'll try and link them here too. So, without further ado, we will start reading Escape from Hell by Mary Irving, Chapter 2. High Commander Rin Tallow sat behind her camp desk. It was one of the few solid pieces of furniture in the mobile camp, but it was still a camp desk. The writing surface was half the size of her desk in the palace, and she'd crowded that space with books, documents, and correspondences, leaving herself only a narrow square to work on. It was claustrophobic, and she hated it. Of course, this late in a campaign, she hated everything. A chill seeped into her quarters despite the thick wall hangings and the fire in the stove behind her. Rin sat back from her work and rubbed the cramp out of her fingers as she reread what she'd written. It had been a disappointing harvest for many across Galilee, and she was writing their neighbors to the south to request a trade, supplementing Galilea's grain in exchange for surplus yield from the mines. The exchange should have been straightforward, but Galilee was on rocky terms with their neighbors, and Rin had to walk a delicate line. Galilee was a small country tucked in the northern hills and mountains. There was enough wealth in the mines to draw the attention of her neighbors, but not enough wealth in the fields to draw their military might. Rin glared at the letter. It wasn't right. She hadn't addressed their concerns about the growing satyr refugee population in their northern province. They blamed the refugees on Rin's Satyr Removal Act. Rin agreed that the satyrs were fleeing south, but if the southerners didn't like it, they didn't have to allow the satyrs in. If the south met them with steel, they would go somewhere else, or they would die as they should. But Rin couldn't say that in a letter requesting a trade agreement, so she was stuck trying to delicately dance around the satyr issue while making a convincing case for the trade deal. She pushed aside the correspondence for now and pulled a report from the stack of work that needed to be done. She hadn't even finished reading the introduction before someone knocked at her door. She had requested not to be interrupted, but secretly she was grateful for the break. Putting off her work was tempting. It would be easier to do in a few weeks when she was home anyway. Rin stood and went to her door. It was late and her support staff had already been relieved for the day. "Yes, Captain Dalton," she snapped. The captain stood rigidly at the door to Rin's quarters. He knew she'd ordered no disruptions, so if he was interrupting her work, it must be for something important. "High Commander, there's been an incident." "What kind of incident?" "A rebel satyr was caught in the supplies." "I'll be right there." Rin left the captain at the door. Her office and her sleeping quarters occupied one large tent in the temporary camp. The space was divided in half by a large maroon curtain with the silver crown and sword emblazoned on it. Rin pushed through the curtain into her living space. Her bed was one of the other few pieces of real furniture in the camp, but like her desk, it could not compare to what waited for her at home. Her wardrobe stood open. She'd already removed her uncomfortable chest plate and shoulder guards for the night, but she still wore her bracers and leg plates. Rin went to the vanity and pulled her straight black hair back into its customary bun. She checked her reflection for stray hairs before pinning the bun in place. Her skin was pale and dark bags stood out below her eyes. She needed sleep, another thing that would come more easily when she was home. Although she wasn't wearing all of her armor, she was still in full uniform, with all the appropriate ornamentation of her rank. The crown and sword were embroidered prominently on her crisp silver-trimmed maroon jacket, reminding everyone of the power she held. Her pants were clean and still pressed despite the day's wear. Rin inspected her reflection. She never left her quarters with a sloppy appearance. Finally satisfied, she threw her cloak over her shoulders. It was too cold to walk across the camp without it. Rin stepped out of her quarters, and Captain Delton snapped to attention. "Take me to the goat," said Rin. "Yes, sir." He led the way through the camp. They stepped around carts being loaded up for the last leg of the journey to Hydel. Rin wanted to be home in her palace before the first snow of the season fell. She could see her breath on the air as she walked, and her boots crunched frozen ground. They would need to hurry if she was going to get what she wanted. Winter was approaching faster than usual this year. An early frost was part of the reason Rin had to ask the Southern Kingdom for grain. "Right around here, sir," the captain said. He led her past the barracks to the workshops. A contingent of tradespeople, carpenters, tailors, and metal and leather workers, kept the soldiers protected, clothed, and armed. The tools they used for their craft also happened to be quite helpful for convincing tight-lipped satyrs to talk. The workshops were a small cluster of buildings. Most of the work was done outside in a large shared courtyard, defined by a fence. Within the fence, the dirt was packed down by workers moving back and forth with heavy loads. Bright lanterns lit up the workspace despite the dark. Large tables were pushed to one side, piled high with tools. There were poles driven into the ground, with rails strung between them to create drying racks. Soldiers were milling around the space, all of whom stopped and came to attention when they saw Rin. As they moved aside, Rin saw the satyr. It was female and a bloody mess. She was slumped on the ground, held up by her arms, which had been lashed to the drying rack. Her horns had been sawed off, and blood still flowed from the wounds. Rin's soldiers would have cut down the satyr's horns piece by piece, sawing off a new painful chunk every time she had refused to answer a question. Rin turned to the highest-ranking soldier among the blood-soaked men and women standing around the satyr. "What did you get out of her?" The sergeant stood straighter at being addressed by the High Commander herself. "Sir, her name is Sochi. We haven't gotten anything else out of her yet, sir." "Just a name?" asked Rin, glaring down at the satyr. She was annoyed with her soldiers. They should have reported the creature when they realized she was being stubborn. Now there were no horns left for her more skilled interrogators to work with. The satyr met Rin's eyes with a fiery defiance. "Sochi, are you going to tell me what you're doing here, or am I going to have to introduce you to one of my more creative interrogators?" The satyr continued to glower up at her. Rin shook her head. "Go get Tyne," she said to one of the bloody soldiers. "Yes, sir," he said. Rin turned her attention back to Captain Delton, while a murmur ran through the gathered soldiers. They all knew Tyne's bloody reputation. He could get any satyr to talk, even with the horns wasted. "Did you find anything on her?" "Yes, sir. Stolen supplies," said the captain, pointing to a small sack on the ground behind the rack. Rin smiled. That made this satyr's actions a raid. There was a sanctioned satyr settlement a few miles away. If it weren't for the contingent of satyr sympathizers in her court, there wouldn't be any satyrs left in Galilea. Rin wouldn't have to make deals for grain. None of it would be wasted on the half-breeds, so there would be more than enough for the people of her lands. The goat-lover commanders from the mountain towns protected the animals over their own people. Until Rin rooted them out of her government, she couldn't touch those few sanctioned settlements, unless they were connected to an attack against a human. Rin went out of her way to pass these villages in hopes that one starving satyr would choose to steal from her and give her an excuse to wipe them out. This Sochi might be good at holding her tongue, but she had fallen for Rin's trap all the same. While we wait for time, begin arranging the extermination squad. We'll wipe out the nearby satyr settlement in the morning, Rin told Captain Delton. Yes, sir. Dismissed, she said, and the captain left to carry out her orders. Sir, the supplies have all been accounted for, one of her soldiers reported, bent over the sack. Good. Have them returned to the storage shed. Rin turned to follow the captain. No, said the satyr at Rin's feet. Rin stopped and glanced down at the satyr. Oh, so you found your tongue? That village did nothing wrong. They have nothing to do with this. I'm not with them, said the satyr. Then who are you with? Why are you here? Demanded Rin. She had no intention of calling back the extermination squad, and Tyne would have his fun with the goat, but any information would be helpful. I was hungry, said the satyr, looking down and away from Rin. A wave of suspicion washed over Rin. Something was wrong. Why was this satyr talking now? She had endured a great deal of torture, only revealing her name. She hadn't interrupted Rin when she gave the order to exterminate the settlement. She only spoke up when Rin turned to leave. Rin followed the satyr's line of sight, but a soldier was blocking her view. She took a few steps closer and looked where the satyr was looking. There was something in the shadows. Rin squinted and took a step closer to the prisoner. Soldier, do you... Rin was cut off by the satyr whipping her head up and spitting on Rin's leg. Surprised, Rin stumbled away from the creature. She looked back at the shadows and saw a glint of metal. Enemies to the east, shouted Rin, pointing at the glint as something whistled past her face. Archers, number unknown. Rin dropped to the ground behind the table. Her leg was in pain, and she looked down at it. Whatever the satyr had spat at her, it wasn't saliva. It had gone through her plate armor. The pain she felt was from it eating into the flesh of her leg. Pus and blood foamed from her shin. Her leg wouldn't hold her weight. Rin glared up at the satyr. Bloody and bruised, it smiled, an angry, hate-filled smile. Rin needed medical attention, but she wasn't going to get it under a hail of arrows. She shouted orders to establish a defensive perimeter, and soldiers raced to carry out her commands. She clutched her leg, trying to stem the flow of blood from her injury. The satyr in front of her laughed. Blood stained the corners of its mouth. The pain in Rin's leg began to diminish, but not because the wound was lessening. It was getting worse. Rin was losing feeling in the leg. She glared at the laughing satyr. Suddenly, everything stopped. Rin looked around in confusion. The satyr was frozen in manic laughter. A soldier's boot was poised above her head, stopped mid-kick. It took a moment for Rin to notice the arrow hanging in the air, inches from her face. She lifted her finger and tapped the arrowhead. It fell to the ground at her feet. Rin hissed in pain. Whatever had caused the world around her to stop had not stopped the poison from eating through her leg. She examined the wound, but before she could establish anything more constructive than the fact that it was disgusting, there was a loud popping noise and a strange figure appeared in front of her. It was a shiny yellow creature with a reflective panel for a face, and it towered over her on two legs. Its hands looked like large gloves, and Rin realized the yellow material and face panel were some kind of armor. The strange armor was bulkier than plate, and made it difficult to tell anything about the figure, other than the fact that it was too tall to be a satyr. It must be human. There was another pop, and another yellow figure appeared next to the first. Then two more loud pops, and two more figures. Most of the faceplates were directed towards Rin, but one turned towards the satyr. It tapped the figure next to it and pointed to the half-goat. What do you want? Demanded Rin, projecting as much authority as she could while lying on the ground with a geyser of fizzing blood and pus streaming from her leg. The yellow figures said nothing. One of them grabbed the two who were distracted by the satyr and dragged their attention back to Rin. They began approaching Rin. She pushed herself back with her good leg, and the movement sent spasms of pain radiating out from her injury. "I'm warning you," she snarled from where she sat, cornered. "I'm the High Commander. Come a step closer and you will be executed." The yellow figures seemed unaffected by her threats and continued to lumber towards her. It took only a few steps for them to catch her as she slowly scooted away. Rin howled in agony when a firm hand grasped her ankle below the wound. Any numbness that the injury had caused was erased as the hand caused damaged muscles and tissues to flex, sending pain shooting up her leg. The figures ignored her, snapping silver bands around her wrists and ankles before stepping back. Rin was confused. The bands looked decorative. She examined the one around her left wrist more closely. A blue light pulsed within it. The pulsing grew faster until a solid blue light glowed from the heart of the material. There was a hiss from the band. Rin held it away from her face just as it burst open and a thick fabric enveloped her. Buried in the fabric, Rin struggled and kicked, crying out as she moved her injured leg. The fabric covered her face, so she couldn't see, and she struggled to breathe as the heavy material pressed around her. An unseen hand grabbed her arm. Then another hand grabbed on the other side, and she was hoisted off the ground. There was another pop and a sensation of being squeezed. Then everything went black. That was Chapter 2 of Escape from Hell by Mary Irving. Links to purchase the full ebook and paperback are in the description below.